You lie down in bed. The room is quiet. The light has already been turned off. The body finally begins to slow down. Your legs relax. Your shoulders sink into the mattress. Your breathing becomes a little slower. The day is over, but your mind isn't. A thought appears. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just a random thought. Maybe something that happened hours ago. Maybe something you need to do tomorrow. Maybe an unimportant memory. And then another thought appears, and another. You try to ignore it. You try to turn in bed. You try to close your eyes more tightly. But something curious happens. The more the body tries to rest, the more the mind seems to wake up. Maybe you know this feeling well. The body is tired. Your eyes feel heavy. But inside your head there is movement, a kind of silent activity, as if someone had left the lights on in a room that should be empty. And then the inevitable question appears. Why does this happen? Why does the mind keep working? Even when nothing is happening, there is no urgent problem right now. You are not solving a crisis. You are not in danger. And even so, the mind continues. It revisits old conversations, simulates dialogues that may never happen, repeats situations that have already ended. Sometimes you even notice how absurd it is. You think, why am I thinking about this right now? But the thought continues. Maybe you have already wondered if this means something. Is it anxiety? Is it stress? Is there something wrong with me? Because it feels strange. During the day, when you are busy, the mind follows the rhythm of your tasks. There is external movement. Things are happening. But when everything becomes quiet, when the phone stops vibrating, when conversations end, when the world slows down, the mind seems to speed up. And this creates a silent confusion, because theoretically, this should be the moment of rest, the moment when everything finally slows down. But often the opposite happens. External silence does not bring internal silence. And perhaps the most curious part is that when this happens, many people immediately assume that something is wrong with them. They think they are thinking too much, that they are anxious, that they should be able to shut off their mind more easily. But there is a detail that almost no one notices. This way the mind works did not begin today. It did not appear suddenly. In fact, this constant movement of the mind is part of something much deeper, something that operates silently beneath human experience. Because the mind was not designed only to think when there is a problem. It was designed to anticipate, to monitor, to predict, to detect patterns. And when the environment becomes silent, these functions do not disappear, they simply become more visible. During the day, the noise of the world disguises this process. Conversations, notifications, traffic, quick decisions, all of this occupies attention. But when the environment slows down, something interesting happens. You begin to hear more clearly the functioning of your own mind. It is like entering a house that always had a faint background noise. But that only becomes noticeable when everything is silent. And then another, even more intriguing question appears. If there is no real problem happening, why does the system remain active? Why does the mind keep running scenarios, as if something needed to be solved? Perhaps the answer is not in the thoughts themselves. Perhaps it lies in something deeper, something that happens even before any thought appears, something that silently decides whether you can truly relax, or whether, for some invisible reason, it is still better to remain alert. And this is exactly where the story begins to change. There is a very common idea about the mind, the idea that it thinks only when there is a problem. But if you observe more closely, you will notice something curious. Many of the thoughts that appear when you're trying to rest are not exactly solutions. They are simulations. The mind returns to old conversations, reconstructs scenes, imagines responses you could have given, projects scenarios that may never happen, not because there is something urgent to solve, but because, for the system that governs the mind, Anticipating has always been a form of protection. For thousands of years, survival depended on noticing signals before something actually happened. A strange sound in the forest, a subtle change in the environment, a different expression on someone's face. The human mind evolved to detect patterns before they became problems. And this mechanism remains active even today, even though the modern world is completely different. Even if, in that specific moment, you are simply lying in bed. For the nervous system, silence does not automatically mean safety. Silence means absence of information. And when there is absence of information, the mind begins to fill the gaps. It imagines, projects, reviews, tests scenarios. Not because something is wrong, but because that is its job. Imagine a radar. The radar does not turn on only when there is an airplane in the sky. It rotates continuously, monitoring, scanning constantly, detecting any signal that appears. The mind works in a similar way. It was not designed to shut down completely. It was designed to remain sensitive to the environment. And that is exactly why the silence of the night often activates this process even more. During the day, your attention is occupied. There are enough stimuli to direct your focus. But when everything slows down, when the body stops, when the environment becomes quiet, the mind returns to doing what it has always done. It searches for patterns, searches for possibilities, searches for signals, and the more you try to force silence, the more the system interprets that something needs to be resolved. This happens because there is a small misunderstanding in the way many people try to deal with the mind. They believe the goal is to make thoughts disappear. But the nervous system was not built for that. It was built to detect movement, to monitor the environment, to predict possibilities. When you try to interrupt this process by force, the effort itself becomes another signal of alert. It is like trying to stop a radar by telling it that something important is happening. The system understands that it needs to pay even more attention. And then the paradox appears. The more you try to stop the mind, the more active it seems to become. Not because it is out of control, but because it is responding to the effort itself. This is the point that begins to change the way many people understand the problem. Perhaps the mind is not active because you think too much. Perhaps it is active because the system that regulates your attention has not yet received a clear signal of safety. And this can happen in a very subtle way. Sometimes there is no explicit fear. There is no intense anxiety. There is only a light level of vigilance, a kind of silent readiness, as if some part of the system were waiting for something that has not yet happened. Perhaps you recognize this, the feeling that the body is tired, but there is a small tension in the background. Nothing dramatic, nothing that seems truly threatening, but enough to keep the system slightly on. And when this state remains for a long time, something curious begins to happen. The mind continues running thoughts, not because it needs to solve something urgent, but because the system has not yet completely shifted modes. It is still functioning as if it needs to remain attentive. And this raises an even more interesting question. If it is not the thought that keeps the system active, what actually maintains this sensation of silent alertness? Perhaps the most important question is not why the mind thinks. Thinking is natural. Thinking is part of the normal functioning of a human brain. The more interesting question is another one. Why at certain moments do these thoughts seem so persistent? Why do they keep running? Even when the body wants to rest, the answer begins to appear when we look at something that happens before thoughts. The state of the nervous system. There is a silent difference between two basic modes of functioning in the organism. One mode in which the body understands that it needs to remain alert, and another in which it understands that it can relax. These two states are not decided by the conscious mind. They are regulated by a deeper system, a system that constantly observes the environment for signals of safety or possible threat. This process happens all the time, even now, even when you are not thinking about anything specific. The system is evaluating signals, body posture, the tone of voice of people around you, the environment, recent memories, internal sensations. All of this creates a silent panorama that helps the organism decide in which state it should remain, whether there is danger or whether there is safety, and here something appears that completely changes the way we understand a restless mind. The nervous system does not need a major danger to remain active. Sometimes a small uncertainty is enough, a vague feeling that something still needs to be monitored. It is not explicit fear, it is vigilance. Like a night watchman slowly walking through the corridors, simply to ensure that everything remains in order. This light state of readiness is very common, especially in people who have spent a long time needing to anticipate things, solve problems, plan, avoid mistakes. When the brain learns that anticipating helps keep everything under control, it continues using that strategy, even when it is no longer necessary. So when the moment to rest finally arrives, the body stops. But the system is still in monitoring mode. It continues running small simulations, reviewing, organizing, testing possibilities, not because there is a real danger, but because the habit of anticipating is still active. And this is where many people begin to interpret the phenomenon incorrectly. They believe these thoughts mean that something is wrong, that the mind is out of control, that there is too much anxiety. But often what is happening is simply a vigilance system that has not yet received the complete signal of safety. It is like an alarm that remains armed even after everyone has already arrived home. The environment is safe, but the system has not yet changed states. And while this state of light vigilance continues, the mind continues producing thoughts, not necessarily important, just movement, like leaves being carried by the wind. And perhaps the most interesting revelation is this: the problem is not exactly that the mind is thinking. The problem is the state in which the nervous system remains while these thoughts appear. When the organism is truly in safety mode, thoughts can arise and disappear without creating so much turbulence. They pass, like clouds. But when the system is still slightly activated, each thought seems to gain more weight, more urgency, more presence. Not because the content has changed, but because the internal state has changed, and this opens space for a completely different perception. Perhaps the goal was never to make the mind stop. Perhaps the key lies in something that comes before thoughts, something that changes the internal environment in which those thoughts appear. And when this begins to make sense, a new question naturally arises. If the restless mind is not a defect, and if it only reflects a system that still does not feel completely safe, what truly allows that system to finally slow down? Perhaps the answer begins with a very simple change in the way you look at your own mind. For a long time, many people have learned to treat mental movement as a problem. If the mind is active, something is wrong. If thoughts keep appearing, something needs to be corrected. But this interpretation creates a curious effect. The more you try to eliminate the movement of the mind, the more attention you give to it. And attention, for the nervous system, means relevance. It means that something needs to be monitored. So the very attempt to silence the mind can end up keeping the system in a state of alert. It is like trying to calm a lake by striking the surface of the water. Each attempt creates more waves. Perhaps that is why so many people experience the same cycle. They notice a thought, they try to interrupt it, they try to replace it, they try to reorganize it, and without realizing it, they enter a relationship of constant control with their own mind. But the mind does not function well under constant surveillance, because surveillance is a signal that something needs to be resolved. And when the system believes something needs to be resolved, it remains active. There is a silent difference between observing and fighting. Observing does not create conflict. Fighting does. When you observe a thought appearing, it simply arises within experience, like a distant sound, like a cloud passing through the sky. But when you enter into conflict with it, something changes. The thought stops being just a passing event. It becomes something that needs to be solved. And solving requires energy. Energy requires activation. This is one of the reasons many people feel that the mind won't stop. In reality, often it is not the mind that is being kept active. It is the relationship of constant vigilance with what appears inside it. There is a kind of rest that does not come from absolute silence, but from the absence of conflict. When the nervous system perceives that there is nothing to fight, nothing to correct in that moment, something begins to change. Vigilance decreases. The need to anticipate decreases. The radar still exists, but it no longer spins with the same intensity. Thoughts may still appear. That is part of the human mind. But they no longer need to be treated as signals of alert. They can simply pass. And when this happens repeatedly, the system begins to learn something new. That silence does not need to be forced. That rest does not depend on controlling every thought. That safety does not mean the complete absence of mental activity. It means the absence of threat. And when the body recognizes safety, the rhythm changes. The breath deepens a little more. The muscles release a little more. The mind no longer needs to search for signals in the dark. And then something curious happens. Very often, the moment you stop trying to make the mind stop, it naturally slows down, not because it was turned off, but because the entire system changed state. Perhaps this is the most important shift in perspective. An active mind is not always an error. Sometimes it is simply a system that is still trying to make sure everything is safe. And when you begin to see this with less conflict, something within the system itself can finally relax. Not perfectly, not immediately, but gradually. Because the body learns through experience. It learns when it realizes that there is no longer a fight happening inside. And perhaps the next time you are lying in the silence of the night and notice that your mind is still moving, the question no longer needs to be, why won't my mind stop? Perhaps the question could be another one. If the mind continues to stay active even when there is no real problem, what would happen if you stopped treating it like a problem? And what if the silence you are looking for does not come when the mind stops, but when you stop fighting it?